at, we'll start by introducing ourselves and where we're calling from. So I'm Emily, and I am calling in from New Hampshire right now, but normally I'm based in Williamstown.
I'm Eva, and I'm calling in from Pownell, Vermont, right over the border from Williamstown right now.
Nice. I'm Emma, and I'm calling in from my hometown in Yarmouth, Maine.
So to get started, we loved your work, Peter. Well, actually, I loved all of your videos. They were so fun. They brought so much joy into my life, and they were really a pleasure to watch. But I was hoping that you could describe your work, Peter, for our viewers, and tell us about how you made it and some of your inspiration for the video.
Yeah, definitely. So Peter was the first thing I made when I came back home after leaving Williams. And it was kind of during a time where I got to be back with my family in a way that I haven't been back with my family in a long time. I think that most of the time, especially over the past 4 years, it's been like, oh, I'm home for a week or two, but it's really just like a stopping point and I go back to Williams. So it was my first time really being back in the house and being like a part of my family unit again. And it was a time to kind of share stories, I think, more than anything else. I'm sure you guys have felt that whenever you're home with your family, sometimes just like in a lull, weird stories come up or whatever. And I remember talking to my mother about my great-grandfather, and she was telling me about how about how my great-grandfather had a pet squirrel. And I was very, very confused by that. And I didn't really understand how, because my aunt had also had a pet squirrel. It's a very weird family thing. But my great-grandfather befriended this random squirrel that lived in their backyard and fed him peanuts every once in a while, to the point where this little squirrel named Peter would just come up to his front porch and sit there and wait for peanuts. And I thought that was the cutest thing in the world, like just picturing that image. I didn't really know my great-grandfather that well. He passed away when I was very young. But I feel like at least that story and knowing like his love of nature and his love of animals really like tied me to him in a way that I hadn't had a tie before. And I had already been working on like stop motion films while I was at Williams, but they were mostly stories of like folk tales, or I retold a Twilight Zone story through stop motion. And I had never really thought about doing things about my own life and my own experience. So I decided to make Peter, which was a short little stop motion about my grandfather's friend, or my great-grandfather's friend. And I don't know, the process was a little bit different than my typical process just because of the circumstances of being at home. When I was at Williams, most of my work, I would do paper cut and then photograph the paper cut dolls. But for Peter and also Little Boats, I decided to go digital with it, which was a very, very steep learning curve at first. I ended up making the dolls in person, photographing them, and then turning them into artwork online, which then I could manipulate. So I could just take my laptop wherever I went and did it. And yeah, I don't know, I really enjoyed the process of doing it digitally. I think since it was such an uncertain time and everything was kind of changing, it was a really nice thing to be able to say, like, I'm going to sit down in front of my computer, even though I think we all hate that at this point. But at that point, it was fresh and new and whatever. And I thought I would just sit down in front of my computer and just focus on this one task of like, I'm going to move this arm today, and at least I'll have done something productive. And I think the process like really gave me some solace in my day-to-day life of being able to be like, I can at least do something that feels productive and in some way like brings me closer to my family and brings me like back to art, which I love doing. So yeah, that's a very long-winded answer to Peter, but
You know, when Emily and I were talking and coming up with these questions, we both realized that we don't really understand the process of animation. Can you tell us a little more about how one animates and why it interests you so much as a medium?
yeah, definitely. Neither do I also. Like, I honestly, animation is something pretty new to me. It's something that I never really thought that I would do, other than when I was a kid, I used to make little claymation stop motion videos just for fun. But actually doing real stop motion, I'm still a little uncertain about. I kind of developed my own method over the past couple of semesters with the paper cut dolls. When I received the questions, I was trying to think about how I even started doing stop motion, and I honestly could not remember. Like, I think maybe I just saw a picture online of a shadow puppet, or maybe you did some kind of reading on it. But I was really drawn to the idea of like shadow puppet theaters, and then realizing that I wouldn't have the devices just by myself to tell the stories that I wanted to. I thought maybe a mixture of shadow puppet aesthetic with an actual stop motion video could be a really interesting way to do it. And I didn't really have necessarily like the big fancy setups that a lot of stop motion people do. I was a photo TA, so I had the shooting studio whenever I wanted it. So I went into the shooting studio, and actually, for my process at least, I wanted it to look like a shadow still. So I laid down transparent architecture paper, because I was in an architecture class, over 2 stools, and then just placed the puppets on top with my camera below it. So it was a very weird, very unstable way of making a stop motion video. But I mean, I'm a photographer. Typically, that's kind of what I would say is my thing. So I ended up just using my camera, taking still images, trying really hard not to move the camera, but shockingly very hard to do. And I don't know, it just kind of sat there for like 8 hours a day, just moving little limbs. And it gets really, really, really frustrating. But then the second you look at the camera and you like swipe through all the images, it just like comes to life in a way that you wouldn't expect it to. And I thought that that was like such a rewarding process. Even though during the time it may have felt absolutely terrible, just seeing like all the images actually move was absolutely insane, because I didn't think I could actually make an animation. And I was like, okay, I guess this is my thing now. I guess I can do this. And it's very exciting.
That's amazing, and must require so much patience, and is really so impressive. I loved what you wrote in your artist statement about wanting your work to help viewers find, you write, beauty in the small moments that might otherwise go unnoticed, and sparking care, resiliency, and love through a process of weaving life and story. Can you tell us a little more about these motivations and how you feel your films sharpen our perceptions and this sense of appreciation for the little details in the world?
Yeah, so I think I've always had this tie to animation in my life. I feel like a lot of children's storytelling relies on animation, which I think is really interesting that we don't see that move towards adult life. But I'm just thinking of when I was a child, I had these like strange obsessions where I would go for like months, maybe even years, like watching the same movie like almost every day. At first it was Alice in Wonderland, the old animated one, and then it went into being Nightmare Before Christmas, the claymation, as well as Miyazaki films, which I mentioned. But I don't know, there's something about the idea of animation. I think I have been trying to like stumble through finding out what animation means to me and why those little moments I think are so important. And I feel like to me, it's the idea of everything in animation is purposefully there. Like you can watch other films and there can be happy coincidences of like, oh, well, the sky looks absolutely beautiful behind this shot. But like the filmmakers, unless they were doing CGI, couldn't make that beautiful sky. Like they just stumbled upon it and said, okay, well, this is what we can use. Whereas animation, I think everything is drawn in, everything is intentional, and there's so much time and care put into like the tiniest little detail. Like there's no other way to capture something, I think, in a more loving way than to like dedicate like 8 hours to just making like one flower bloom or something like that. And I think that's just something really special that only animation has. And I don't know, like every time I go out for a walk, especially at the start of all this, I took a lot of walks just to kind of escape. And every time I would walk by like a field and see grass blowing by, I immediately thought of like Hayao Miyazaki and like Kiki's Delivery Service. And I think that's such a like beautiful thing. And that shows like incredibly successful use of art. The fact that like almost like 15 years from the first time I watched that movie, like every time I see something that's like little and delicate in the world like move in that way, I immediately think of his art. And I just think that's really beautiful. As far as my art goes, I think we talked a lot in class about the idea that you can only hope to know what it'll do to the audience. Like, there's no way of knowing. You put out this art into the world and you kind of have an expectation of what you think people will take away from it, but you can never know for sure. And I think, like, especially now, and especially in May, I guess, when I was finishing these pieces, I personally needed a lot of peace. Like, it was just like a really messy time. And to me, I was hoping that, like, when people view the art, maybe they don't take anything away from it, but I want them to feel like it was like a meaningful experience and like a space where they can stop and just watch something and like forget about any of the stress that they're having. Just watch a story about like love or friendship or like resiliency, anything like that. Just have that moment of pause to be able to sit and kind of reflect and hopefully take away this feeling of like maybe being thankful for the little things, because there's no way right now to be thankful for the way that the world is other than to thank the little things and just think about like, you know what, like that iced coffee I had today was incredible and it like had just the right amount of sweetness and bitterness in it. Like, it was a perfect balance. So for me, at least, when the world gets kind of bad, I turn to those little things and I hope to like show that through my animation as well.
On the subject of intentionality, in your work, The Selkie Bride, which is so stunning, and I think you can really see how it's kind of rooted in what you were talking about before, folklore and those kind of tales. There are two scenes where your scheme of black, white, and blue, you just get this shockingly passionate feeling of red. You paint the background red. And I know for me, it really caught my attention, and it kind of accentuated that moment. And I was wondering, as the artist, how did you make those choices with color, and why did you choose those scenes for it?
Yeah, I think I've always kind of been a nerd about color. As I've said like a lot, I'm just kind of a lover of movies anyways, but I'm one of those people who has the Pinterest board full of like Wes Anderson like color palettes or things like that, or just random funky palettes that I really like. When I initially came to Williams, I wanted to go into like graphic design or advertising, and so I really like had been studying these color palettes for so long without really having any use for them, and kind of just thinking of them as something completely separate, as like, these are what are aesthetically pleasing. And then I took a class on color. It was a color tutorial with Professor Sen this past fall, and I think that changed my relationship to how color works a lot. Just thinking about the emotional intent behind color. I think everybody always knows that there's emotional intent behind things, like red can mean anger or passion or whatever, but I had never really thought about using color in that way, but also pairing that with like the aesthetic nature of color. Honestly, the red in The Selkie Bride was kind of a happy accident in the fact that just due to the way that my process was working, I needed transparent colors only. And once again, benefits of being a photo TA, I had these like lovely color gels that I could use for the blues, but I couldn't find like the right red. And I really wanted to show this moment of like falling in love, or like the first look of falling in love with that red. So I went on a little bit of a color scavenger hunt around the art building, which I strongly recommend to anyone to do. It was very fun. I probably looked like an absolute maniac running around with like a ton of different things in my hands. But I ended up going down to the sculpture studio to complain to one of my friends who's a sculpture TA about how hard it was to find like this red. And I found that she was using this like sparkly red tissue paper, and I just took it away from her and ran up and just had a lot of fun like crumpling and uncrumpling it to try to get that effect of like a burst. And I used that as well for the red in the scene where they're stealing the pelts. I don't know, it was a really fun time to experiment with the idea of color. I used it more, I guess, in my work with Peter, and that was a little bit of a different experience. I had gouache paints that I'd been planning on using during my senior semester class, and I just ended up not using them. So I decided to paint color backgrounds and then animate those into the story as well. Because I really like that like lo-fi feeling that comes with using like found materials and the cutout paper, and I didn't want to lose that in the digital pieces. So I was trying to find ways to make it still feel like homemade, handcrafted, because not that polished animation is bad. I think polished animation is incredible. I just know that where I stand currently, it's not possible for me. And I also just really like once again, the like little details and care and intention that comes into like these homemade feeling things. Like I still want it to feel a little bit like textural and crafty. So that's kind of where I come from with color. I just try to seal it all.
Thank you so much. A quick follow-up to that question. I love the soundtracks to your movies too, and I'm wondering how you choose them, where you find the music, and how you feel about the relationship between the sound and the visuals.
Yeah, I also am really into music. I do concert photography on the side. Actually, when I was still in school, I would be driving up and down to Albany and Boston and places like that. So music is incredibly important to me. The Selkie Bride itself, I went with a song by Hozier because he's also an Irish singer and it's an Irish tale. And I got that Irish blood in me too. And I just felt like it just felt perfect with that. But then my recent pieces, the soundtrack was actually done by another student, Kate Osborne, who I absolutely love her music. She's a good friend. And I reached out to her and I actually had her blindly watch the animations and score some music to it, because I know that other people might have a different feeling than I have towards the animations themselves. So I kind of wanted that to come from a viewer standpoint of how the music would blend in.
So you mentioned when we were talking about Peter, how when you went home after the chaos that was last spring, it kind of changed your trajectory. Your story became much more personal. Do you see that having a lasting effect on your work moving forward?
I think I do. I think for a lot of my time in academia and the idea of specifically not just college but high school as well, I think a lot of art classes, they put so much emphasis on the idea of saying something with your work that's like big, or I always felt this need to like say something that was like incredibly important and big and like changing the world with my art, which is incredible, but something that I think that maybe doesn't need to be emphasized as much as it does. I think that making art for you, like for your own person, is something that's kind of a radical thought in academia. And the idea of like, I'm not doing this for the grade that I want, or I'm not doing this to make a big statement. I'm doing this because this is something that fulfills me as a person. And I think that that's something that I wish I had gotten earlier from my own work. I think the way that I see how I make art has changed a lot. Like even since I've been home post-graduation, I've just been doing really stupid little doodles in my sketchbook, and I love them, and my friends love them because they're just dumb and they make us happy, and I feel like that's enough for art. You know what I mean? Like as far as my animations went, like they're things that bring me joy. They're people and stories that bring me joy. So why would I not want to share that joy?
Emma, thank you so much. We have to wrap up now, but this was such a treat. And thank you so much for sharing a little bit more about your process, your motivations, your thoughts. It was really a delight for me.
Thank you. Yeah, this was fun.
Thank you so much. This has been an amazing opportunity. Thank you. And your work is fabulous.
Thank you.
I totally agree. All right, take care.
Thank you. Bye.
Bye.